Hi, I'm Kevin Hatley and welcome to Kevin Hatley Photography in my office. This is a channel that I've set up to share my experiences of wildlife and nature with others. So let's go. Here in the UK as bird photographers we can sometimes get distracted by the fact that there's lots of beautiful, small, colourful birds like kingfishers, goldfinches, the tip family, and they're all great birds to photograph. But when we look at our larger birds, and especially the one that we're going to look at today, it's one of the largest birds here in the UK. As a beginner, it's probably one of the easiest subjects to be able to approach, to find and to photograph. However, the swan in itself, because of its such bright white colour, can prove at times, if it's very bright, to be technically a little bit difficult. But what I want to do in this video is share with you my experiences and my knowledge of photographing swans. So what we'll do is we'll look at the swan family here in the UK and how to identify them. We'll look at their habitat and where to find them. We'll look at their lifestyle and their behaviour, and then I'll share with you my approach to photographing swans, and I'll share some tips with you along the way. Okay, so how are we going to identify our swans? Here in the UK we have three types of swans. We have the mute swan, the whooper swan and the buick. The mute swan is our resident swan, with both the whooper and the buick being winter visitors, although there is a small population of whooper swans in the far north of Scotland. So how do we tell the difference between each of the swans? Well, if we start off with the mute swan is the largest of the three, and it has an orange bill. And the main differences between each of the swans is their size and the colours of the bills, which I'll explain. So starting off with the mute swan, it has an orange bill. On top of that bill there is what's known as a blackberry, or a knob on top of its wattle, which I'll show you in a picture. The difference between the male and the female is that the male, which is known as a cob, has a very large blackberry on top of its bill, and during the mating season this enlarges, whereas on the female, which is known as the pen, it's a lot smaller, and again you'll see that in the photographs that I'm about to show you. When it comes to the swan's calls, they are slightly different. The mute swan certainly isn't mute, but it tends to generally communicate in grunts, which you'll see in a short video clip. When it comes to the difference between the whooper swan and the buick swan, it basically comes down to two things: the size of the bird itself and the colour of its bill, as I previously said. So if we start off with the whooper swan it's larger than a buick swan. It has a wedge shaped head. Again, you'll see this in the pictures. On the bill there is more yellow on the bill, and it has a large neck. The whooper swan's call is it's a honking voice. Again, you'll see that in the clip, which sounds like an old-fashioned car horn. When it comes to the buick swan is smaller than the whooper. So in sizes, it's mute swan's the largest, whooper swan's the next, and the smallest is the buick swan. When it comes to the bill on the buick swan, you'll see that there is more black than there is yellow. It has a rounded head and it has a small neck. The call of the buick swan is a softer call, which can seem like a little dog yapping, and again you should pick that up. Okay, just to summarise the difference between each of the swans. It's mainly down to the colour of the bill. Starting off with the largest swan, the moot swan, it has an orange bill. The whooper swan has more yellow in its bill than it does black, and the Buick swan has more black in its bill than it has yellow. When it comes to the cygnets, identifying the cygnets, the easiest way to do it is if you see the cygnets with the parents, to know that, you know, that's a whooper swan cygnet, or that's a moot swan cygnet. So the easiest thing is to see them with their parents, but I'll show you some pictures and a little bit of video of cygnet swans. So where are we going to find swans? Well, swans can be found throughout the whole of the UK. The resident moot swan you'll find on virtually any piece of fresh water in the UK. The main places that you'll find them are things like lakes and ponds, rivers and canals, estuaries and wetland marshes, and you'll also, especially in winter, you'll find them on farmland. What I'll do is I'll show you a video clip now, and what I'd like you to try and do, following the bit I did on the identification of the whooper swan and the Buick swan, is to see if you can tell the difference. It's not easy. When it comes to diet, swans tend to feed on things like water plants, insects, snails, and again, especially in winter, cereal crops. Swans will feed on the surface of the water, but they'll also use the powerful legs and the bills to disturb the bottom of the water feature that they're on to actually feed by upending themselves. And again, you'll see that in the clips. Okay, moving on to swan behaviour. Swans are known to live for anything up for about 20 to 30 years. They form bonds between the cobs and the pens when they're about 2 to 4 years old, and they normally remain bonded for the rest of their lives. And they don't normally start nesting, usually, until they're about 4 or 5 years old. What will happen is that the pen, which is the female, will incubate on average about 6 eggs, and the nest itself is built on a heap of vegetation. And the cob will remain nearby to protect both his pen and his nest with his cygnets. The cygnets are basically looked after by both parents. Moot swans, especially during the breeding season, can become very aggressive and defensive in relation to the nests and their territory. And again, I'll show you a little bit of video on swan behaviour. Okay, what I want to do now is just take a little time out and give you a look forward to a 3-part series video that I'm putting together on understanding light and exposure. When I began my journey into wildlife photography, I found the whole realm of exposure and exposure triangles, exposure compensation, exposure values. It's quite difficult to understand, but what I want to do is I want to put these videos together that are aimed purely at wildlife photography. So if you're a wildlife photographer, you're a beginner, what I'll do is I will share with you some of the mistakes that I made to make sure that you don't make them, and I'll make it in a way so that it relates purely to wildlife photography. So a 3-part series coming about wildlife photography and understanding exposure. In this section, what I want to do is share with you my approach to photographing swans. What we'll do is we'll look at camera settings, exposure settings, and I'll also cover with you some top tips. If you use any of the automatic modes on your camera, the camera itself is going to decide what the exposure value is. And that's when you have to use exposure compensation, which is so important when it comes to photographing swans. Because if you don't, it can lead to underexposed images, especially when you're photographing white subjects. And as I said, therefore you have to use exposure compensation. In addition to having to use exposure compensation sometimes when you're photographing swans, there are a couple of other things that are very helpful when you're photographing things like white birds, especially swans. Firstly, there's a histogram. It's important that you can read a histogram so that you can adjust your exposure correctly. And here I've got 3 examples of an underexposed histogram where it's all the way across to the left. We've got a correctly exposed histogram where the histogram is balanced, and then we have an overexposed histogram whereby the histogram is all the way over to the right and you can't recover once you lose that light. The other thing that can help you is to use your highlight alerts, or what's commonly known as blinkies. If you set your highlight alert, what will happen is that if you have overexposed an area, that area will light up and it will blink. That's why they're known as blinkies, alerting you to the fact that you are overexposing. So therefore you can then make the adjustments to get the correct exposure. So remember, when you're photographing something that's particularly white and bright, that if you're photographing in an automatic mode on your camera, so that's aperture priority, shutter priority, or even manual with auto ISO, then you're going to have to use exposure compensation to make sure that you get the right exposure value. And also remember to read your histograms and switch your blinkies on. Okay, so what I want to do now is share with you my top 5 tips on photographing swans. Tip number 5 is location. Best location to start off with is in your local park and your local lakes, canals, rivers and around about. Swans, you can generally get quite close to them, and they're used to human presence as well. Tip number 4's got to do with wind direction. Swans are big birds, so therefore what they will do is they will fly into the wind to get the lift that they need. So when it comes to photographing swans, especially in flight, and again I'll show you a clip, the best place for you to be is to have either the wind coming left to right or right to left, so that you get the picture of the bird in flight, or you want the wind to be coming off your back, going that way, so that the birds are flying towards you. Position of the wind is important. Camera settings that I would initially set up, my go-to settings, and again this will depend on the light, would be f8, 1/500th of a second, and auto ISO. That's just for your swan that's moving about on the lake or the river or the canal, just swimming along. For birds in flight or swans in flight, again I'd use an aperture of f8, the big birds, minimum shutter speed of about 1/1250th of a second, and again auto ISO. Tip number 3 is to do with birds in flight. Swans are an easy subject. If you're a beginner to wildlife photography and photographing birds, swans are a great subject to begin and to learn on. Because they're such big birds, they're slow flyers, they're a great subject to get up close to. So tip number 3 is to photograph swans in flight to improve your birds in flight photography. Tip number 2 is to do with the size of your lens. I would recommend 2 lenses. Firstly, a zoom lens in the 100 to 500 range, and also a wide-angled lens, something between 24 to about 100mm. Swans are great to photograph in the environment, and what you're looking to do is try and get some pictures of the swan in their environment or with their cygnets out on the water. And finally, tip number 1, we covered it earlier on, is to make sure that you set your blinkies, your highlight alert, you know how to read a histogram, and you're happy to use exposure compensation. And exposure compensation will be one of the subjects that I will be covering in my forthcoming 3-part series on wildlife photography and understanding exposure. As these birds are approaching me at the moment, what I want to do now to finish off is just share with you some of my favourite images that I've taken of swans. I hope you enjoy them. Okay, thanks for watching this edition of Kevin Hatley Photography and How to Photograph Swans. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have photographing these beautiful birds. All I would ask is that if you've liked it, could you hit the like button? Could I also ask you to consider subscribing to my channel, Kevin Hatley Photography. It's completely free, doesn't cost anything, and it just keeps giving me that incentive to improve my channel and share my knowledge and experience with others of wildlife and nature. So, until the next time, stay safe, take care, and I hope to see you soon. Bye for now.